Well, today's daf is daf Yud Dalid, and we begin with the Mishnah on the bottom of Yud Gimel Amid Beis, and we're talking about Pigul. Now, the discussion about Pigul is going to focus on what's called the Shalmei Atzeres, Kivsei Atzeres, which means that there were two kvasim, translated as lambs, that were shechted on Chag HaShavuos, and they would be matir the shtei alechem. And the question is, let's say, for example, he had a machshava of chutz lizmano at the moment of the shechit of one of the two kvasim. And he had a machshava that he would eat the lechem chutz lizmano. So let's try to go through the Mishnah. Shochat shnei kvasim lechol achas menachalos l'mocher. So there are two possible scenarios which are going to be the focus of our attention. One is where his machshav of chutz lizmano, which is the machshavas pigul, was only on one of the two lechamim, right? There were two chalos that were brought. And the other possibility would be, let's say he had a machshav of chutz lizmano even on both chalos, but only at the point of the avoda of one of the two kvasim. So first the Mishnah has the case of shochat shnei kvasim. So it seems like he had the same identical machshav of chutz lizmano when he shechted both kvasim, but he only had a machshava on one of the two chalos that he would eat at chutz lizmano, meaning lemochar. And now we have a parallel case with regard to lechem aponim. Why? Because in lechem aponim also we have two bezichim, which are spoonfuls of levona, and they are matir the two starim of lechamim. Right? There are six six lechem aponim, lachme ponim, and another six lachme ponim. So now, hiktir shnei bezichin, so he had the machshava of chutz lizmano at the time of the aktor of both bazichin, which parallels the previous case where he had the machshava of chutz lizmano on one of the two lechamim during the shechita of both lambs, and now during the aktor of both bazichin, lechol echad min astarim lemochar. And he's going to eat one of the two sections, which is made up of six lechem aponims, tomorrow, meaning chutz lizmano. So in both of these cases, the Mishnah records a machlokas between Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim. Rabbi Yossi, Omer, oso achal v'oso aseh shechish lo pigul v'chayov lo kares, but hasheni posel v'ein bo kares. So the Shem Pigul, which generates a chi of kares, is only chal on one of the two lechamim in the first of the two cases that we had, and on one of the two starim in the second case of lechem aponim. And the chacham omrim zeh v'zeh pigul v'chayov v'nolei kares. So according to the chachamim shita, once you have pigul on one of the two lechamim or on one of the two sdarim, it automatically effectuates pigul with a chi of kares on the other lechem, in the case of shtei lechem, and on the other seder, in the case of lechem haponim. Rabbi Yossi, on the other hand, holds that there was never a machshavas pigul on the other lechem or on the other seder, and therefore the machshavas pigul can only be chal on one of them, on the one that he had a machshav of chutz lizmano. And now we get to Rav Huna, and today's daf is basically focused on Rav Huna for the most part and slugging up Rav Huna. But first we'll understand Rav Huna. Omer Haya Rabbi Yossi. I'm going to reinterpret Rabbi Yossi. In the case of pigul b'yerech shel yemid lo nispagel hayerech shel smol. Now, what happens when you have a regular carbon, let's say, for example, I don't know, a carbon shlomim, it doesn't make any difference right now. And the carbon shlomim has two thighs. There's a right thigh and the left thigh. His machshavas pigul was only on one of the two thighs, either yerech of yamin or alternatively yerech of small. It makes no difference, as Rashi points out. And you might say that here Rabbi Yossi would be modeh that there's a tziruf, there's some sort of integration of both legs, both thighs of the lamb that's being brought because it's all part of one entity. But Rav Huna says no. Just like we saw Rabbi Yossi in our Mishnah, he says if you had a pigul on one lechem, it's not mafagel the other lechem, or on one seder, it's not mafagel the other seder. So too, if you had a machshavas pigul on one yerech, it's not mafagel the other yerech. My time, iboy sema svara, iboy sema kra, iboy sema svara lo adifa machshava mimaisa hatuma. Very strange kind of analogy, but in tuma, if let's say one of two thighs contracts tuma, like say a sheretz falls on one of the two thighs, it does not effectuate tuma on the other thigh. And the same thing is going to apply here, that even though there was a chalos pigul based on his machshav on one lechem, it doesn't affect and effectuate a chalos pigul on the other lechem, and same thing with regard to lechem upon it. So all the Mefarshim here are bothered by this analogy here because in the case of Tuma, each leg is a separate entity. So for sure, if the Tuma reached one leg, it doesn't affect to be metame the other leg. But what does that have to do with a karma, which is made up of two parts? Like, for example, the shtei lechem, there we might assume that the pigul, as the Rabbanan say, effectuates both lechamim. And even if you reject the chachamim, as Rabbi Yossi in fact does, but nevertheless, the Gemara is arguing that in the case of one thigh, where he had a machshavas pigul on one thigh, Rav Huna argues that it does not affect pigul on the other thigh, just like tuma does not affect the other thigh. But why does that make any sense? You know, tuma luchud and machshavas pigul luchud. And faket, the Gemara thinks that this svara of lo adifa mimaisa tuma doesn't, right? According to the Mefarshim who object, it doesn't really convince us at all, because in the case of two thighs of one carbon, it makes sense that it's one entity, and therefore the machshavas pigul and the chalos pigul on one should affect the other. But anyway, that's the logic of Rav Huna, and he calls it a svara. Iboy say makra. Now he has a pasuk. Banefesh ocheles mimena avonot tisa. So we're going to emphasize the word mimena, which means that the chiyuv kares, which is the subject of this pasuk, is only mimena, below michaverta. In other words, to the person who eats it, and there's a mir to not something else, and the other something else is the other yerech that he didn't have a machshavas pigul on. Esvei Rav Nachman l'Rav Huna. So if we want to, we could calculate a whole slew of kashas and objections the Gemara is going to raise against Rav Huna, because the bottom line is the Gemara thinks that even though Rav Yossi says that the two lechamim of the shtei lechem are separate entities, and pigul on one doesn't affect the other, the same thing in two starim, but in the case of two thighs of the same keves, the same carbon, certainly Rav Yossi would agree. So now Rav Nachman quotes a brisa. And the Brisa says, Olam ein, we'll have a lot to talk about the word Olam as we go on, but Olam ein bo kares, ad sheyifagel b'shteihen b'kezayis. Okay, now we are talking about the minimum amount of volume of an ochel, which becomes pigul, because machshavas chutzes manu, has to be a kezayis. Now, what does it mean, ad sheyifagel b'shteihen b'kezayis? It sounds like, according to this brisa, you need a machshavas pigul on both lechamim of the shtei lechem. And therefore, if you had a machshavas pigul on one of the two lechamim, the second lechem is not pigul. I mean, that sounds awfully similar to Rabbi Yossi. However, we're going to be medayik in the lashon of the brisa, b'shtehen in the achas mehen lo. So again, if you had machshavas pigul on one of the two lechamim of the shtei lechem, that would not effectuate pigul. So Mani, who does this brisa follow? Meaning, which shita is reflected by this brisa? Ilim Rabbanon, that's impossible, because afil bi'achas men nami. The Rabbanon in our Mishnah go on record is to say that if you had a machshavas pigul on one of the two lechamim, it effectuates pigul on the other lechem. And yet here it says, ad shifagel b'shtein. El pshita, we have no question about it, it's Rabbi Yossi. So we see that according to Rabbi Yossi, if he had a machshavas pigul on one of the two lechamim, it does not effectuate pigul on the other lechem. Now, it says here in the brisa, ad sheyifagel b'shtein b'kezayis, which would mean that if he had a machshavas pigul b'shtein, right, on both lechamim of a kezayis, then it would effectuate pigul on both lechamim. Iyamid bishlema chad gufahu. If we're going to assume that in the case where he had machshavas pigul on one of two yerechim, one or two thighs, that it effectuates pigul on the other side, on the other thigh against Rav Huna, then mishum hachi mitztarif. Now I can understand why this brisa, which we've proved is attributable to Rabbi Yossi, then in the case where he had a machshavas pigul b'shtein b'kezayis, then what's the halacha? The halacha is it would be pigul. Correct? So if we reject Rabbi Yossi, if we reject Rav Huna's interpretation of Rabbi Yossi, and we come to the conclusion that a machshavas pigul on one thigh would affect a machshavas pigul on the other side, then we could justify the tziruf in the case of shtei lechamim for pigul. And therefore, if he had a machshavas pigul of an olive, of a kezayis, from both of them together, half a kezayis of one lechem and another half a kezayis, another lechem of chutzes manu, then he's chayv, there is pigul with a chiyuv kares if he eats it. Because if we're mitzaref two thighs, then we mitzaref two lechamim. And now we start today's daf. Ela iyam retrei gufei ninu. But if you're going to tell me the way Rav Huna had it, that in the case of two thighs, we're going to consider this as two separate entities, and therefore if you had a machshavas pigul on one thigh, it does not generate pigul on the other thigh, according to Rabbi Yossi, is mimitz tarif. How could you say that in the case of a machshavas kezayis on both lechamim, we're going to combine both lechamim to make up that same kezayis? I mean, in the case of two thighs, at least they're physically attached. In the case of lechamim, they're not attached. So we can certainly derive the conclusion that if in Shtei Alechem we can be mitzaref, we can integrate uh, both lechamim, if he had a machshava of a kizayis on both lechamim, then, right, then we would certainly say that in the case of two thighs, a machshavas pigul on one thigh would effectuate pigul on the other thigh. But that's against Rav Huna's understanding of Rabbi Yossi. So now the Gemara is going to come up with what it believes to be a third shita, not Rabbi Yossi and not the Chachamim. Homani Rebihi. The Sanya we learned to the Brisa Shochet es hakeves lechol chatzi zayis michalazu. So now we're talking about the two kvasim of the Shalmi Atzeres of Shavuos that are matir the two lachmei toda. I'm sorry, the shtei alechem of Shavuos, and at the time of the shechita of one keves, he had in mind to eat a chatzi zayis of one of the two lachamim chutzes mano, and at the time that he shechted the second keves chaveru lechol chatzi zayis michalazu. So he's going to eat a half a zayis of the second lechem of the shtei lechem chutzes mano. Rebbe Omer anish zeh kosher. So the reason why zeh kosher, apparently in the way we read the brisa, is because it was a chatzi zayis michalazu and a chatzi zayis michalazu, and that cannot effectuate pigul because there's no pigul on a chatzi zayis. Taima di'omer chatzi zayis. Aval omer kizayis mishtein. If he says that he's going to eat one kizayis from these two lachamim, it's tarif. So here we have a proof that Rebbe holds that there is a tzir of pigul for the two lachamim because he had in mind a kizayis of both lachamim. And his machshava now it integrates both lachamim together. So therefore, if he had a machshava of chutzes mano on a kizayis worth of both the lachamim, then that effectuates pigul. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, Rebbe al Daman. Okay, you've now attributed this brisa to Rebbe, but who does Rebbe have? I mean, we only have two possible shitas, that of the Chacham and that of Rabbi Yossi. If Rebbe is saying that he holds like the Rabbanon, we said according to the Rabbanon that if he has a machshav on one lechem of chutzes mano, it effectuates pigul on the other lechem. So why would Rebbe say no? It's only if he has a machshav on both lechamim. Even if he had a machshava that one of the two lechamim, a kizayis would be eaten chutzes mano, that would effectuate pigul. And yet in the brisa, Rebbe says that he had to have a machshava on both lechamim. According to Rabbanon, you only need machshava on one of the two lechamim. Ella, what? We have no choice, but I'll leave it to Rabbi Yossi. Is then Hadra Kushon Leduchta. Now we go back to the original kasha and the objection that we had against Rav Huna, because you see that the machshava of pigul on both lechamim, according to Rebbe, and Rebbe holds like Rabbi Yossi, is mitzarif the two, even though the two lechamim are separate entities, then how much more so in the case of a physical, what's the word I want to use? A physical attachment, if I could call it that, of two thighs that are attached to each other. Certainly, the pigul on one would effectuate pigul on the other against Rav Huna. Liolam, I'll leave it to Rabbanon. Let's go back and say that this brisa reflects the shita of the Rabbanon. Now, if it reflects the shita of the Rabbanon, then how could it be that it says Hashochas Hakeves Lechol Chatzi Zayis Michalazu? And we would medayik from that if he would say kizais mishtehen, then it would effectuate pigul according to the Rabbanon. Even if he only had a machshavas pigul on one of the two lacham, it would affect pigul on the other, like we saw in the case of two thighs. However, lo tema ad sheyafagel b'shtehen, that you need a pigul at the time of the shchita of both kvasim. He had to have a machshavas pigul at the time of both kvasim. Ela ema ad sheyafagel b'shnehem. He changes stehen of female to shneim of male, and now the right. Right. I'm sorry. I don't know what I just said, but let me say it again right to make sure I got it right. Lo tema, don't read that shefagel b'shtehen. Oh, now we have to know that the word lechem is feminine. That's what I forgot to include here. So shtehem means that he has to have machshavas pigul on both lechamim. And that's against Rabbanan, because Rabbanan hold that machshav on one will effectuate pigul on the other. Ela ema, let's change it from shtehen to shnehen, and now we're saying that he has to have machshav on both at the shchita of both of the kvasim. And this introduces the principle of ein pigul b'chatzi matir. The matir for the shtei lechem is both kvasim, not one or not one of the two. It's got to be on. He's got to be oved the avodas hakorban on both, and therefore afilu be achas mehen. Oh, afilu be achas mehen. We're going now according to the Rabbanon, and the word achas we said refers to the lechamim in Lashon Nekeva. So therefore, he could have this machshava at the time of both kvasim of chutzes mano of a kizayis of one of the two lechamim, because the Rabbanan hold that if you have a machshava of chutzes mano on one of the two thighs, it effectuates the other thigh as well, and if you have machshava of chutzes mano on one of the two loaves, it effectuates what do you call it, pigul on the other lechem as well. So therefore, if we're going to say ad sheyafagel v'shneim afilu bi'achas mehen, so again, he has to have machshavas pigul on both lambs, because otherwise it's chatzi matir. But as far as the lechem is concerned, no, afilu achas mehen, achas referring to the lechem, because that's the sheet of the chachamim that a pigul on one affects pigul on the other. Lafuki Rab Meir Diomar mefaglim b'chatzi matir. So according to Rab Meir, if let's say at the time of the shchita of one of the two kvasim, he would have machshavas pigul on a kizayis, that would affect pigul, even though it's chatzi matir, because Rabbi Meir holds that there is pigul on a chatzi matir. So again, let's go over this one more time. The shnei kvasim are one matir, both. You need both. And if you had machshavas pigul on one of the two, then you don't have both matirim. You only have machshavas pigul on one of the two matirim. Reb Meir holds that a machshav on one of the two matirim is enough to effectuate pigul, but the chachamim hold no, ein pigul b'chatzi matir. It's kamash malon dulo. Right, the Bryce wants to tell me lafuke against the shita Rabbi Meir, and therefore he has to have bishtehen. What's bishtehen means? I'm sorry, bishnehem. I keep making that. Bishnehem. Bishnehem means at the time of the shechita of both lambs, because otherwise the machshavas pigul at the time of the shechita of one of the two lambs would be pigul b'chatzi matir. And this is all lafuke Rabbi Meir. Frek the Gemara. Now the Gemara has trouble with the word li'olam. Yihachimar li'olam. The word li'olam in the Gemara's mindset means that we have to maximize all the possible cases. And if we're coming lafuke, let's say Rabbi Meir, we want to be lafuke somebody else as well, because li'olam. So if we're going to assume that you can have machshavas pigul. That would effectuate pigul only if it was at the time of two lacham. If it was vis-a-vis the achila of two lachamim, that's called bishtehen. And then it's coming to establish that what? Lafuki mirabanan. And bishnehem, which means at the time of the shechit of both lambs, and it's lafuki Rabbi Meir, because Rabbi Meir holds yesh pigul b'chatzi mate. Now we're saying bishnehem, no, on both lambs he has to have machshavas pigul because ein pigul b'chatzi mate. Rabbi Yossi. And now we justify the word liolam, lafuki mit Rabbi Meir, right? So the word, let me get this right, shnehem is coming lafuke Rabbi Meir, and the word shtehen is coming lafuke midrabbanan, because shtehen means on both lechamim, and according to Rabbanan, a machshavas pigul on one of the two lecham would effectuate pigul on the other lechem. Is hainu to come liolam elai amrit Rabbanan. But if you're going to tell me that this brisa should be attributed to the Chachamim, and there's only one lafuke, and that's going to be the text that says bishnehem lafuke min Rabbi Meir, because you're not mafagel unless you have the machshavas pigul on the shechita of both lambs, because ein pigul b'chatzi matir is my liolam. Why did you add the word liolam? So therefore, once again, the Gemara goes back to assume that this brisa should be attributed to Rabbi Yossi. And if it's attributed to Rabbi Yossi, then according to Rav Huna, Rav Yossi says that a machshavas pigul on one thigh and one yerech does not effectuate pigul on the other thigh. So how could he possibly say in this brisa that if he had an intention in his machshava to have an achil of chutz lizmano of one kizais of both lechamim, that would generate pigul, because we're going to integrate the two lechamim. If you can integrate two lechamim, how much more so should you integrate two thighs that are made of that comprise one guf? So that's the first kasha that we're going to ask on Rav Huna. Now we get to the second kasha. V'yod ha'maravashi Toshma. We have a brisa. Rebbe Omer Mishum Rabbi Yossi Pigel b'dover shenasa b'chutz. Okay, so now we're talking about the parim anisrafim, and we're going to say that this part of the avodah is done bachutz. Now, the word bachutz is a little bit tricky because it's referring to the azara. Normally, bachutz means outside the azara. Here, bachutz, the word bachutz means in the azara. Bifnim means in the heichal, because we're talking about Parman Srafim, and their avoda is done bifnim in the heichal, right? Except for we'll see. You'll have Shvicha Shirayim, Yisod Amarovia, the Mizbeach HaChitzon. So he had Pigul b'Dover Shenasa b'chutz, or Pigul b'Dover Shenasa b'fnim, lo Pigul Ketzad. Right? The brisa is now going to explain in detail. Hoya Omei b'chutz. Right? He's standing in the Azara. The Omer, and he declares already Shokar Amanas lahazos midom l'mochar. So his machshava was on the Hazah, which is bifnim in the Heichal. Just 1 second. How come he doesn't tell you? Oh, just 1 second. I'm just trying to figure out this Gemara here. He says we're talking about chatzos hapnimios, like parhel and dovishal tzibur, right? That the hazah is in the heichal. So again, the shechita is in the azara. The dam is brought into the heichal, and there's hazah on the parochas. Okay, right now we'll suffice at this case of Par Helim Dovishal Tzibur. Forget about the Parmenisov. Leave that out. Okay. Now we have a case, right? And again, at the time of his shchita, which was Bachutz, he had a machshava of Hazah Chutz Lizmano with Hazah's Bifnim. Lo Pigel, Shemachshav Bachutz, B'dov Shanasa Bifnim, that's not considered Pigel. Now we have the flip case. Haya Omi Bifnim, the Omar Reni Maze Almanat, right? So he's ready for the Avodas Hazah, which is done Bifnim in the Heichal, and he makes the declaration, Reni Maze Almanas Lahakter Emurim L'Mochar. So the Aktaras HaEmurim is done on the Mizbeach HaNechosh, Mizbeach HaChitzon in the Azara. Or alternatively, Almanas Lishpoch Shirayim L'Mochar. The Shvicha Shirayim was Bachutz in the Azara on the Yisod HaMizbeach, Lo Pigel, Shemachshav Bifnim, B'dov Shenas B'chutz, or the other way around, is not, right? Machshav B'chutz, B'dov Shenas B'fnim, Machshav B'fnim, B'dov Shenas B'chutz, that's not Pigel. Hoya Omei B'chutz, now he is in the Azara, the Omar, and he makes a declaration. Hareini Shochet, so again, the Shechita is in the Azara. Almanas Lishpoch Shirayim L'Mochar, and the Shvicha Shirayim is also in the Azara. Or he has in mind Lahakter Emurim L'Mochar, his Chutzos Manu is on Haktaras Emurim, which is also done and performed on the Mizbeach HaChitzon in the Azara. Pigel Shemachshav Zachutz B'dov Shenasa B'chutz is Mefagel. Okay. So the Gemara asks the following question. Lishpoch Shirayim La Fluge Mai. Right? So let's take the case, for example, of a Machshava Bachutz Almanas Lishpoch Shirayim Lemochar, which we said is Pigel. So the Gemara asks the following. Le'ifagule Mai. Which part of the carbon becomes Pigel such that if you eat it, you're chayiv kares? Gule dam. Now, dam does not lend itself to pigul. Why? Because dam is a matir and not a nitar. Dam mi mefagel v'atnan, and now we have a whole list of matirim that are not nitarim, and there's no pigul on them. If you eat it, you don't get kares. Pigul hakometz. Right. So if he eats the kometz, he could never be chayiv mishum pigul because kometz is a matir. It's matir the shirayim. Valavono. And the lavono likewise is matir the haktoras hashirayim. Vaktoras. There's nothing in the ktores that makes it into a dovra nitar. Uminchas kohanim. Minchas Soch, Minchas Kohen Mashiach, right? These all different, like Minchas Kohanim is probably the Mincha of the Kohen Gadol. Let me just double check if he supports what I just said. Minchas Kohanim, Minchas Nesochim, Minchas Kohen Mashiach V'Adam. So Minchas Kohanim, Minchas Nesochim, Minchas Kohen Mashiach. Again, I don't want to get bogged down on this because we'll never finish the daf. Minchas Kohanim, oh, he says that's a carbon nedava of a mincha of a kohen. And then we have minchas nesachim, which accompanies a carbon shalom, a carbon ola. Minchas kohen Mashiach is Kohen Gadol has to bring, oh, so this is the minchas chavitim that he brings every day. V'adam. Again, in all these cases, there's no shirayim lachila, so just 1 second. Oh, So if it's a minchas kohanim, which we said was a voluntary mincha, is burned totally on the mizbeach. So there's no nitar. And of course, if he donates nesachim bifnei atzmon, so again, there's no nitar. Vadam, and dam is a matir, not a nitar. So what is it in this carbon that's mechayiv kares v'yitzet b'tor spiegel el pshita lafliif palgule basar, that the basar itself becomes pigul. Oh, so now we get to Rav Ashi's kasha on Rav Huna. Hashta uma hasam deloch shiva be bebasar gufe. Right? He had a machshavas pigul on something other than the basar. Like, for example, a murim that is be burnt on the mizbeach, or on the shvichas shiari adam. And yet, Omar Rav Yossi mefagel, right? The basar itself becomes subject to pigul. Why? Because it's all part of one entity. Is hacha the chashiv be bezevach gufe. Now let's take the case of the two thighs, the two reichayim. Lo kolshkein the pigul b'yerech yibin, pigul b'yerech small. Fiod in a third kasha. Amar Ravina Tashmad, kasha Ravina from Mishnah. Hakomitz mincha lechol shireha ola haktekum tzolem. So at the time of the Kmitza, he had a machshavas pigul of chutzes mano regarding the shirayim or the aktoras hakometz. Mo de Rabbi Yossi bazu shepigul v'chayoven lekores. Again, it can't be that he's chayiv kores feeding the komets, because the komets itself is a matir and not a nitar. So it's got to be that the chiv pigul is on the shirayim, which is a davar nitar, because the komets is matir the shirayim, and therefore Mod Rabbi Yossi a pigul. What becomes pigul? When he had a machshavas chutzes mano at the time of the Torah of the komets. Ilem laflugi komets. No, we just established from the Mishnah that there's no pigul on the komets. Komets is a matir, not a nita. Komets mean mafagim. But tonight we go through the whole Mishnah again. El dvarim shein chayoven alem mishum pigul hakomets. Ela pshita flugi shirayim. The davar nitar here that could be subject to pigul is the shirayim. Hashta uma hasam delo chashiv behu b'shirayim gufe. Right, he had a machshava of chutzes mano on the haktoras hakomets, and that effectuates pigul. Even Rabbi Yossi agrees. Well, at the time of the haktoras hakomets, he had a machshava on the achilas shirayim. So it must be that we connect and integrate the komets with the shirayim. Is therefore hashtuma hasim lo chashiv v'hu shirayim kigufe. Right, his machshava was on the Aktorah mefagel.